What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's prediction episode for UFC Paris Bahario versus Imavov, where I'll be discussing and breaking down each and every fight. Talk about last week, our lock of the week came through. This is our fourth week in a row now where lock of the week comes through. We had pure absolute domination from Aljo. Our 3-week safety lock streak comes to an end last week. Just absolutely embarrassing performances from Min Yang Zhang and Michel Pereira. We had Michel Pereira losing by knockout. It should have been him getting cut from the UFC, not Kyle Dawkins. It really should have been him. And Min Yang Zhang losing in China, I don't think anyone expected that. We went 7-5 last week. Not the worst, but we can definitely do better than that. Log of the week, Aljo, he comes through. Log of the week has been consistent for about 4 weeks in a row now. So we'll keep up cooking with the lock of the week. Anyways, let's get started with the first fight of the night. First fight of the night, we have Shauna Bannon versus Sam Hughes. My pick for this fight is going to be Sam Hughes. Okay, so between these two ladies, we obviously have a huge experience edge with Sam Hughes here in her career and in her UFC career. 10 fights in the UFC versus 3 fights in the UFC. So we've gotten to know a lot more about Sam Hughes and what she has to offer in the cage versus the amount of fights that we've seen from Shauna. We know that Sam Hughes, she's a well-rounded fighter. Her striking is effective. We know she likes to utilize her wrestling as well. She actually had an undefeated amateur kickboxing career as well. She generally has strong cardio and she can push the pace as the fight goes on. And Shauna Bannon, on the other hand, she's light on her feet. She bounces in and out. She has good striking. She knows how to use her sidekick to push her opponents off and manage her distance in that way. Her wrestling is coming along as well. She just came off of a nice armbar finish in her last fight, and she can push the pace as well. She can be aggressive. Her striking defense can be a bit questionable at times. She can get hit, but so does Sam Hughes. And I think Shauna, she's going to want to keep this fight on the feet for the most part and try to pick Sam Hughes apart from range, but maybe she might try to sneak a submission in if she can. But I just think that the gritty veteran of Sam Hughes is going to be able to push the pace on her, charge in on her, grind her on her against the fence, drag her down, and get control on her with the wrestling. So there's a chance that Shauna can sneak in a submission on the ground, but I just think Sam Hughes is too experienced to get caught in something like that by a somewhat newcomer in the UFC scene. And Sam Hughes is skilled on the ground. I do think Shauna is going to land some nice shots on Hughes as she's coming in, because Hughes gets hit often, but ultimately on her way to getting hit, I think she will be able to secure some takedowns, enough so that she wins the fights, because ultimately Shauna is too controllable. It seems like she's a decent striker, but it's too easy to take her down. If she isn't going to pull a submission on the ground, then that round is basically over. Sam Hughes wins that round, and Sam Hughes, her striking has come along too. She's putting up some nice boxing combinations in her recent fights. She actually has good boxing herself, and I think Sam Hughes can edge this one out. So uh, I'm taking the UFC veteran to pull off a gritty, wrestling heavy win. Her boxing is really good too, like I said, and she has strong cardio. She's going to be able to push the pace on Shauna, who she is light on her feet. She does have nice side kicks, and her grappling is improving, but I just think she's hittable, right? Too hittable right now, and Sam Hughes has that uh experience on her, and I just think her wrestling, grinding on Shauna against the fence is going to be able to win her this fight. So moving on to our next fight, we got Brad Tavares versus Robert Bryczek. I'm picking Brad Tavares to win this fight. So we all know Brad Tavares at this point. He's a decent striker, not an elite level striker, but good enough to compete with other journeymen. He has some nice takedown defense. He's hard to get a hold of or control him. Uh, he's only lost to great competition. He's lost to Dricus Duplessis, Israel Adesanya, Robert Whitaker, Yoel Romero, Gregory Rodriguez, and also some other losses on his record that hasn't aged as well as those. But he's fighting Robert Bryczek, who's only had one fight in the UFC, and he lost it, and it was versus Ihor Potieria, which is possibly one of the worst losses you can have on your record. If you're losing to Ihor Potieria, you have no right at all being in the UFC. You're not gonna make it in the UFC if you're losing to Ihor Potieria. Ihor, He is possibly one of the worst fighters on the roster right now, and it's as close as you can get to a layup fight in the UFC. And by losing to him, you're missing that layup. Maybe it was his debut, his nerves. Maybe it wasn't. I just don't think that should happen. Uh, if you want to actually be a contender in the UFC, it doesn't matter. Brad, he has 26 UFC fights, 16 wins already in the UFC versus Robert, and Robert lost his debut to Ihor Petore. If you're picking Robert to win here, you're definitely trolling. There would be zero logic to pick him here. Brad has a ton more UFC experience than Robert. He can fight at range, pick him apart, really high takedown defense at 81%. And I just think the veteran can show levels on the feet versus the 35-year-old newcomer, the prospect in Robert, who's coming into this matchup as a fighter who's primarily a striker and has a ton of first round finishes in his career before joining the UFC. But that's exactly what those guys are, not UFC level, the guys that he's fighting. And they were either a bunch of old, unathletic men or guys with just terrible records. And again, being primarily a striker, then losing to Ihor Potieria, who is pretty much every striker's dream matchup in the UFC just because of how easy of a layup that is. It just isn't a good look. Robert, he gets hit with a ton of leg kicks. He doesn't have the best striking defense. His cardio beyond the first round is pretty much non-existent, while Brad is known for winning fights by decision. Just seems like a perfect matchup for Brad, who has the better cardio, better striking, better all well-rounded experience, and I just think he can easily pick him apart here the whole fight, especially after the first round, stuff any takedowns and add another win to his record. Brad might have to weather an early storm in the first round, which could be tricky for him because he's been caught by heavy hitters in the first round before, but never to someone at this low of a level. So excuse me. Uh, as the fight goes on, Brad, he will get in his rhythm. He'll manage distance nicely. Um, Hit him with some good leg kicks, outpoint him throughout the fight, technically outstrike him. And we know Brad's cardio is really good, while Robert's cardio looked like he's never fought past the first round. So as the cardio starts to slow down for Robert, as the punching power of Robert starts to diminish, I can see Brad start to pick up the pace and drown Robert as the fight goes on, landing the much more convincing shots, especially in the second to third round. Brad, he has 26 UFC fights. He's a solid striker. And he has elite takedown defense. He can keep this fight where he wants it. And he does have the cardio to go all 3 rounds versus Robert, who lost his UFC debut to Ihor Petore. Very poor cardio versus the first round. I just see Brad Tavares being the veteran that he is. He's going to school Robert, picks him apart and probably win a decision here. Moving on to our next fight, we got Sam Patterson versus Trey Waters. My pick is going to be Sam Patterson to win this fight. So I think Sam Patterson is a great fighter. He got caught by a monstrous right hand in his UFC debut. But other than that, I thought he looked good. I don't think he's going to have to deal with that insane one-shot knockout power here. Trey Waters, he's good. And he has good accuracy. But I do think it's more about how accurate Trey Waters' shots are more than how powerful they are. Waters, he only has 2 knockouts on his record. And I feel they've both come from him landing on the right button than having that insane one-shot knockout power. And that's still dangerous, but it's not the same way Patterson got knocked out. And recently, Patterson, he's been looking good, on a 3-fight finishing streak in the UFC. They're not to the greatest competition. Obviously, he's still climbing his way up in the ranks. But he did just come off of a very impressive victory versus Danny Barlow. He just knocked out Danny Barlow in the first round, I believe, where Sam Patterson was a big underdog in that fight. He gave Barlow his first ever loss, and Patterson, he showed some great finishing instincts there. He did get hit with some few shots, remained patient, found the one shot that shifted the tide, and he just started pouring it on until he got the finish. He's fighting Trey Waters, who's 2-0 in the UFC, 2 decision wins versus Patterson's 3 finishing wins in the first round. And his 2 decision wins, they're against no one impressive really. Trey Waters, he's tall, one of the tallest in the division, super long arms. He likes to strike from outside, but he tends to keep his hands low. He's vulnerable to leg kicks. And I think Sam Patterson can take advantage of that and swarm him with some pressure during the right moments, because Sam, he can somewhat match his length in height, and he'll actually have an inch reach advantage over Trey Waters here. So I think Sam's striking is just a bit more technically sound. He's confident coming into this matchup, coming off of 3 finishes in a row. And if this fight hits the mat, uh, it'll be cruise control for Sam Patterson. I think he's much better on the ground, and I think he'll be able to use the striking to land some takedowns after outstriking Trey Waters. I think he'll be able to mix in some takedowns after that, and if Waters wants to play it safe and strike from the outside, I think Patterson can hang with him in there, then close the distance to land some takedowns. And if the striking isn't favoring Sam Patterson, and if Waters decides to come forward and be aggressive, I think Patterson can definitely take advantage of that as well. So the pick is Sam Patterson. He's a sharp striker, is improving finishing instinct. He has improving finishing instincts, and he can wrestle if he wants to. Waters, he's very tall, but he's hittable. He keeps his hands low, and he has limited power, in my opinion. I don't think he's going to be able to knock out Sam Patterson. So I just think Sam Patterson will be able to outstrike him from range, and he can mix in the takedowns if needed, right? So moving on to our next fight, we got William Gomis versus Robert Ruchala. I believe that's how you pronounce it. My pick for this fight is William Gomis to win this fight. As soon as I saw this fight, I see William Gomis, who's 4-1 in the UFC, fighting in France versus someone making their UFC debut. Initially, my instinct told me this is a layup fight for the hometown guy. William Gomis, he's much more experienced. He's in his hometown, and he's fighting a UFC debut guy in his hometown. This should be a layup fight for him, right? But this guy, Robert Ruchala, he's actually a KSW world champion. Of course, that's no UFC world champion, but a champion in a known organization. His only loss that Robert has, it's to a pretty decent fighter in that organization where he got knocked out by a body kick. But other than that loss, he's finishing guys, he's winning decisions. His last 3 wins are by knockout, which is good to see for him. I just watched some tape on him. Like, the guy's pretty good. He's dangerous. He comes forward while still being defensively sound, and he breaks you down, landing punch after punch. His pressure with his footwork, it can be discomforting for his opponents, but he's still taking the time to find the right shots, to eventually break you down or find the right shot to put you down. He's not just rushing in there with his head up in the air, but with his chin up in the air. But he has some nice, powerful kicks as well. He can go to the head. He has powerful spinning kicks. He does get hit in his fights, and he's been dropped multiple times. But in his fights, he learns to manage distance as the fight goes on. He's usually patient. He doesn't rush things. Works in the clinch really well. He has great reversals too. When he missed a kick in his last fight, the opponent was on top of him, and Robert, he effortlessly reversed positions and remained on top. And he had dominant control on top, transitioning between positions, taking taking the back, and then finding himself in mount, and ultimately raining down elbows until he got the finish. Like, he's definitely a capable fighter, and I think he belongs in the UFC. But the only red flag about him is that he does get hit too often in his fights. And versus William Gomis, his style is a tad bit more safe. He doesn't pressure it forward as much. He's known to be a point fighter, I'd say. Out of his 5 UFC fights, only 1 fight did not go to a decision. He's usually going to a decision. He knows how to stay safe on power punches. He's never been knocked out. He uses teep kicks really well to create distance between him and his opponents. He gauges distance really well. He has decent head movement, decent footwork to evade shots, and he's kind of like a sniper. He dances around the cage and snipes you with a right hand, or he dances around the cage and whips a body kick and then keeps moving. They both looked impressive, but the thing is, Gomis has looked impressive against UFC level competition. He beat Joe Anderson Brito, in a fight that was mostly a striking affair, and Robert hasn't proved himself against UFC level competition. And when it comes to fluidity as well, I'm giving a slight edge in fluid movement to Gomis, who looks like he has a tad bit better footwork and overall movement in this game. I think Gomez strikes are a bit more effective, and they seem to be a bit more pop in his shots and in his body kicks, which look like his body kicks really sting when Gomes lands. And like I said, he has fluid movement. His ability to use footwork at a high level has been impressive. His ability to manage distance between him and his opponent, it's a big green flag. And I think Ruchala's best chance at victory would be to close the distance, try to get in the clinch, try to wear Gomes down, and try to take him down. But I feel that won't be an easy thing to do against Gomes, who will most likely at least win the first 2 rounds by outpointing Robert, stuffing any takedowns, breaking away from the clinch positions, and maybe if he's gassed out, if Gomes is gassed out during the 3rd round, Robert can capitalize and land a takedown. But Gomes has heart. Um, he fights until the very end. So even then, I can see Gomes winning the third. I can see Robert kind of chasing the whole fight while Gomes is dancing around the octagon, stops to land the power shot and keeps moving around, evading the power shots and stuffing any takedowns coming his way. So I think Gomes is going to be able to stay safe. He's going to be he's going to do what he usually does, which is be a rangy striker. He has good footwork and he's proven against UFC level competition. Uh, versus Ruchala, who is a KSW champion. He is a dangerous striker, but he's hittable and he's fighting in France. The whole crowd is going to be against him. There could be a debut nerves playing a part as well in this fight. So I just think William Gomez's movement, his accuracy, and his experience, it's giving him an edge over Ruchala, which is the fight is taking place in France as well. So moving on to our next fight, we got Andreas Gustafsson versus Rinat Fakhretdinov. This was actually a really tough pick, but I'm gonna go Andreas Gustafsson to win. I actually picked Andreas Gustafsson to win his last fight as an underdog versus Chaos Williams, but I didn't know he was gonna do him like that. I actually went 12-1 in that card, that specific card. I remember that card, Marab versus O'Malley too. I have proof it's in one of my earlier videos. Anyways, but what a sick performance that was. Such a one-sided beating, an actual savage performance by Andreas Gustafsson. Just moving forward and ragdolling Williams. The whole fight landing hard shots in the clinch, mixing in takedowns, broke Williams down so easily, it seemed like. And he said after the fight, Gustafsson said he doesn't even watch tape on his opponents because Vikings didn't watch tape when they went to war, or it was something like that. And he made a promise before the fight that he will go, and this is literally in quotes, he said he will go full retard in his debut. And after that fight, he says he lived up to that promise, and he did. Like the guy is kind of scary. But I don't think Andreas is going to have the same ease to initiate the same game plan he did on Chaos Williams on Rinat Fakhretdinov. But if he does do that to Rinat, just let him fight for the title because that would be extraordinary. However, I do think Rinat will be much harder to control in terms of dragging him down or even getting a hold of him. Rinat is a proven wrestler who, when things get tough, he gets tougher and grits it out until the very end. His UFC record is a bit controversial and can be a bit questionable. Many people thought he could have lost to Zaleski dos Santos and Nicolas Dalby. The majority of the world thought he lost to Carlos Leal, which he basically did, but still though, 6 fights in the UFC, still hasn't lost. That means he's doing something right. He's a tough dude and he fights hard until the very end, but so does Gustafsson. Both absolute warriors in this matchup. One thing I want to say about Gustafsson, which kind of impressed me back when I found this out, was that as amateurs, he fought and beat Christian Leroy Duncan back in 2018, which, excuse me, which was pretty cool to see that he beat Christian Leroy Duncan, considering the level of striking that we're seeing from Leroy Duncan nowadays. But this fight is essentially going to be Gustafsson Greco-Roman wrestling versus Rinat's combat sambo wrestling. They're both aggressive. They're both powerful strikers, both very tough, coming forward, trying to implement their will. And based on what we saw in their last fight, Andreas was in beast mode from start to finish. He looked like he could do that for another 5 rounds if he had to. Granted, he was not fighting another high level wrestler, like he's about to here. Uh, but still, though, it was still impressive. And at the end of the fight, at the end of his last fight, Gustafsson labeled the fight as a hard workout. He's mentioned it was just a hard workout. And I don't know what it is about him saying that, but that is such a green flag to see it, for him to see it in that way. It shows like the way he views the fight game isn't as serious as other fighters. It kind of takes a lot of pressure away from him. Instead of being like, oh my God, this is my UFC debut, I have to win. Uh, he's calling himself a Viking who doesn't even need to watch tape on his opponents to beat them. He goes in there just to smash them. I feel like his mentality is one of his greatest assets his high when it comes to high pressure situations. And I just feel like him viewing the fight in a way where he's like, oh, it's just a hard workout in front of a bunch of people. That really impresses me, the way he's viewing the fight game. And when we saw Rinat go a hard 3 rounds in his last fight, he continued to press forward despite the intense pace of the fight as well, just like Gustafsson did. But it was like the pace was definitely taking a toll on Rinat, and I feel like the cardio could favor Gustafsson here in this matchup. And I think this fight is going to be close. I think it's going to be fireworks. Rinat will be a step ahead here in terms of experience, and I think in terms of wrestling technique as well. But I just think Gustafsson might have more of a dog in him. And just 5 fights ago, we saw Andreas go to war and lose against someone named Joyton Lotterbach, who's a far less superior fighter than Rinat, but that fight could have gone either way. And we've seen Andreas go to war in another fight earlier in his career where he lost as well. So in their overall career, Rinat has the more wins, but he hasn't looked more dominant, because Renat's been in some wars that could have easily went the other way. In terms of who won, but he managed to sneak the win through the judges' scorecards, and he's done that multiple times. I think that this fight will look similar to the Carlos Leal fight, where Rinat is shooting for takedowns, getting his takedowns defended, eating shots, trying to close the distance. And as the fight goes on, I think Andreas's cardio will benefit him and allow him to take over the later rounds of the fight and ultimately get the better of the exchanges, whether that's in the wrestling or the striking. And I think this fight does go to distance. Both guys, they're refusing to back down, but I think Andreas can edge this one out and give Rinat his long overdue first loss in the UFC. And I'm a big Rinat fan, but I tried my best to stay as objective as possible here. And as long as there's no robbery going on, I think Andreas can actually get this one done. So I'm picking his aggressive Greco-Roman wrestling style to help him here. He has an insane pace and he just has that Vikings mentality, which I really like. And Rinat, he is undefeated in the UFC. He's a tough wrestler, but he's had controversial decision wins. So he's not really undefeated. So I'm going to pick Gustafsson to outpace Rinat late in the fight, and I think he's going to edge a decision. Hopefully there's no robbery in this fight. Moving on to our next fight, we got Marcin Tybura versus Ante Delaji. I'm gonna go Marcin Tybura to win this fight. So this fight is actually a rematch. These guys fought in 2015 and the fight ended in a TKO because Ante, I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name. Ante actually threw a leg kick, then Marcin checked the leg kick, which snapped Ante's leg in half. And Marcin got a TKO because Ante couldn't continue after his leg was snapped in half. The injury was so bad that Ante couldn't fight for a little more than 3 years. And then Marcin makes his way into the UFC, and Ante, he fights his way to the PFL. And 10 years later, they meet again in the UFC on September 6th. So, Tybura, he's been on quite the 2-fight run recently. He gave Jonathan Denise his first loss, then he goes on to give Mick Parkin his first ever loss right after that as well in the UFC. And he showed good takedowns. He showed good ground and pound versus Jonathan Denise. He showed heart versus Mick Parkin, staying in the fight, winning the first round, winning the third round on the stand up, and not to mention the 22 total fights that UFC fights that he has as experience on his record. He is 39 years old though, but the guy he's fighting, Ante, is 35, just now entering the UFC, making his UFC debut. uh his name is Ante, and he's fighting it making his UFC debut, and he's fighting entering the UFC with a one fight win streak. But to be fair, he did do fairly well in the PFL. But of course, the PFL level isn't as close to the UFC level of fighters. So Ante, he is going to be coming into this matchup seeking revenge from that broken leg that happened in 2015. But I think Marcin's UFC experience will help him out here. He's a skilled grappler. He has the cardio to go 3 rounds despite being close to his 40s. And Ante is vulnerable to getting hit. He gets hit often in his fights. Ante does have the ability to land a quick one punch knockout and end it early, but the last person to do that to Marcin was Tom Aspinall. And before Tom Aspinall, it was some other fighter in 2019, and he's had 13 fights since that fight in 2019 where he's gotten knocked out in the first round. Ante can look decent against lower tier competition, but even even in competition where even then, like in competitions that there are fights in the PFL where he wasn't looking so good, right? And I think someone like Marcin, who's a veteran in the UFC, can deal with someone making their debut at 35 who hasn't been super impressive out of the organization. This is going to be a good fight. Both guys, they want it. It's a heavyweight fight. I think Marcin can use his skill, his fight IQ, and experience to weather any early storm from Ante and win the fight as it goes on. So I'm picking the UFC veteran to use his strong grappling, be durable, and have his proven cardio, keep the fight where he wants it, probably out kickbox Ante on the feet. And, Ante, he is a PFL veteran, but he's debuting at 35. He's very hittable, and he might have too much emotions coming into this matchup as well. He's like, oh, I want to seek revenge for that broken leg back in 2015. I just think Marcin, he's veteran savvy. He's going to be able to control the fight and most likely win a decision here. Moving on to our next fight, we got Oumar Sy versus Brendson Ribeiro. My pick for this fight is going to be Oumar Sy to get it done. I think Oumar wins this fight because I think he'll be able to take down Brendson Ribeiro. Ribeiro, he can have decent striking sometimes, and it could help him in this fight for sure. Ribeiro knocked out Bruno Lopez in the Contender Series, which isn't too special. He was out striking Dr. Nurgazai, which also is nothing too special, but he could definitely outstrike Oumar Sy here. But the thing is, we've seen Brendson Ribeiro get taken down. We saw in his fight versus Magomed Gadzhiesulov. Magomed Gadzhiesulov took him down pretty much whenever he wanted to when they fought. Magomed was ducking under punches and driving in with a double leg, landing nice trips on him as well. Uh, and we also saw, and that's pretty much why Magomed won the fight. It was pretty much based off of those takedowns. And we also saw Dr. Nurgazai. We saw him get takedowns on Brendson. We saw him take down Brendson pretty easily in that fight when Dr. wasn't comfortable striking with him. And yes, Brendson, he did pull off that armbar or that Kimura win against Dr. But I think Oumar, he's too skilled on the ground to get caught with something like that. I think he's also too strong. Brendson Ribeiro, he was able to pull off that Kimura against an out of shape, soft bellied, overweight Dr. And against Oumar, I think Oumar is constantly coming in his fights in great shape, and he's just so jacked and strong. It'll be hard to pull something like that off on Oumar. So on the feet, it could get competitive. Brendson, he isn't some world class striker. He just got TKO'd by Azmat Murzakanov, and we saw what Min Young Zhang did to him. Two real high level strikers with solid power. So I'm not saying that Oumar is going to knock him out or anything like that. I think the striking favors Brendson here. I just think Oumar Sy can hang with him on the feet enough so that he's able to work in some takedowns that will lead to either a ground and pound finish or a submission. And if he isn't able to do that, if he isn't able to hang with him on the feet, I'm sure he can constantly just take him down at will, while not getting submitted. So he can just drive Ribeiro against the fence or force a takedown. And Ribeiro, he likes to pressure forward and he likes putting that pressure with his strikes. And once he gets into that rhythm of getting in his flow state and his striking, it's pretty easy to time a takedown on him and surprise him by changing levels. But this should be a good fight here. Oumar Sy, he's coming off of probably the most disappointing performance I've ever seen, where he was fighting against Alonzo Menifield, where he received his first ever loss in his pro career, and it seemed like he was just so scared of getting hit. He was so hesitant, and I think he was having a hard time uh, taking Alonso Menifield down because of how short Alonso Menifield is. Trying because being the taller guy, it's harder to get in on the hips of the shorter guy. I don't think he's going to have that problem here. But in that fight, he was so hesitant. He couldn't engage in the striking at all. I think he was just so scared of getting hit. He landed a few good leg kicks, but he continued to run away the whole fight. And in the second round, he pressed Alonso up against the cage. He barely landed a takedown. He did land one, and it was working out for him. It's what the game plan should have been from the start. I'm not sure why he decided to strike with the better striker. So I think he learned from that fight. He was winning in the second round when he was pressing him up against the fence. But even if that was considered boring or whatever, it was still working out for him. And I think he should have continued that. Um, because in the third, he continued to run away from him and not engage in the striking. There was so much things that he could have done differently there. But Alonso's a decent opponent. It's a great win for him. He holds a ton of power in his hands, so it's understandable to not want to strike with him. But he really made Oumar Sy look like a rookie with the boxing side of that fight. And I don't understand why he wouldn't continue to try and wrestle Menifield in the third. It could have been because he was gassed and didn't have enough energy to do so. But I think he learns from that fight, sticks to what he is good at. I think he's going to be able to grapple Ribeiro because we've seen many people take Brendson Ribeiro down, because Oumar, he can usually take his opponents down, and when he does, he has relentless ground and pound. He can submit them or control them, and I feel like this fight, his last fight, I mean, uh, it was definitely a learning experience for him, and I think he knows how I think he knows he has to work on his striking in this camp. Hopefully, he has been working on his striking in this camp. Either that or just not give up on the wrestling at all. Like Oumar, he's a huge guy. He's one of the biggest guys in the division. Just a huge frame. He's 6'4", 83 inches reach, and he has potential to be really good if he just tunes in on the few mistakes he made last fight. I think he'll be able to land constant takedowns on Ribeiro, and that's pretty much the story of this fight. And if he isn't able to get them, it could be trouble for Oumar Sy because his striking game, at least based off of his last fight, it's just not where it needs to be, especially if he shows up the same way he did last fight. But I think he'll learn from that. And in this matchup versus Ribeiro, I think it kind of favors Oumar, in my opinion, because Ribeiro puts himself out there and he's not like a real boxer with his guard up, picking his right shots. And he can be a bit of a wild man at times and take chances on the feet, which isn't as threatening as an Alonzo Menifield type of fighter who's only looking to find the right shot to put your lights out. But still, I do think Ribeiro's striking is good enough to beat Oumar Sy's striking, but I just think the grappling of Sy will be able to be showcased here and could likely pull off a submission after Ribeiro gets comfortable on the feet and gets taken down by a few well-timed takedowns. So, and yeah, like I said, Oumar Sy, he's a huge guy. He's a huge guy, 6'4", 83-inch reach, powerful wrestler. My only concern is his striking. He has very hesitant striking, but I don't think he's going to be worried about not being able to take down someone the same height as him, as Ribeiro, because I think he had a hard time taking down Alonzo Menifield because of how short and close to the ground he is. Like, it's easier to defend his hips. It's harder for Oumar Sy to get in on those hips, and I just think he's not going to have that problem versus Ribeiro. So even if he does have that hesitant striking, I still think he can close the distance and press on Ribeiro, who is a wild striker, but he has poor takedown defense, and he does have different dangerous submissions. But I do think Umar Sy is skilled enough to deal with those. So I think he's going to be able to get the takedowns, and he's going to have the ground control to overwhelm Ribeiro on the ground. So pick is Umar Sy. Moving on to our next fight, we got Patricio Pitbull versus Losene Keita. 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 So my pick for this fight, I'm going Keita to win this fight. So Pitbull, he just showed everyone he can still fight, even as a 38-year-old man. Hanging in there with Dan Ige, not having to deal with the tricky length of someone like Yair, like he did in his UFC debut. He was able to showcase a more dominant performance his last time around, landing some nice takedowns, some sharp right hands, and he was landing some nice right hands down the middle. Clearly, he can still compete with UFC caliber fighters, right? But to be fair, Dan Ige is 34-year-old man. He's a 34-year-old man himself, right? So, however, now Pitbull is fighting Losene Keita, a 27-year-old hungry to make his UFC debut, a proven finisher outside of the UFC. This guy isn't coming to back up or coming to point fight. He's coming to put the pressure on. He's fast, he's explosive, he has quick combinations, he has a strong jab, has shown great takedown defense. He has a great personality too. Like, I like this guy. I think he's a great UFC addition to the UFC, coming in at the right time, not coming in when he's out of his prime. And I think he's definitely a fun addition to the roster, and I think he's a dangerous matchup for Pitbull. His only loss in his career was when he was winning a fight and he was about to work some ground and pound from top control, and some unfortunate leg injury happened to him. It was hard to tell exactly what happened, but he was most likely on his way to win that fight, and he pretty much still should be undefeated coming into this matchup. But this will for sure be his biggest test against Dan Ige. This is definitely the best grappler he's ever faced, and despite him having great takedown defense, it's not yet been proven against a UFC level fighter. I do think he can defend those takedowns though, keep this fight on the feet, put the pressure on with his strikes. A Pitbull is sneaky though. He can lure you into a striking match and hit you with a well-timed counter shot, then instantly shoot for a takedown, and that's just a veteran part of his game. But still, I think now Pitbull, he's proved he can win in the UFC against the 34-year-old Dan Ige. I don't think he'll be as hungry as a 27-year-old European prospect eager to make his debut. I think Keita will be locked in for this fight and show great things in the UFC, starting out with outclassing Pitbull on the feet. So I'm taking Keita to win. He's fighting 38-year-old Patricio Pitbull, who's a veteran. He has good boxing. He has good wrestling. Pitbull's durable. I just think the 27-year-old Keita is an explosive striker with solid takedown defense, and he's hungry to make his debut. I think his youth and his pressure striking is good enough to be an aging vet like Pitbull. So, moving on to our next fight. Um, Another time? Okay, let's do it another time. I'm busy right now. Moving on to our next fight, we got Modestas. Wait, that's not Modestas Bukauskas versus Paul Craig. I'm picking Modestas Bukauskas to win this fight. I mean, we gotta go Modestas here, right? 5-1 in the UFC. His only loss is to a dangerous striker in Vitor Petroni, who's a really good striker. Bukauskas, he's 31 years old right now, in his prime, fighting an out of prime 37-year-old Paul Craig, who only has one win in his last 7 fights. How can we not pick Bukauskas here? He's got fast, fluid striking, diverse spinning kicks, roundhouse kicks, moves well on his feet for someone his size. He can switch stances really well. He knows how to feint really well, and his grappling has been coming along as well. Defended takedowns nicely in his last fight. Um, and throughout his career as well, he'll actually have a 2-inch reach advantage over Paul Craig as well. He's a sharp striker, capable of knocking your lights out with the right shot. And Paul Craig, he can be a bit chinny, and I don't think Paul Craig has the boxing to compete on the feet with someone like Bukauskas, which means he needs this fight on the ground to have any sort of success. Greg does a good job utilizing his kicks, body kicks, high kicks, but I just don't see that working against a high level striker like Bukauskas. Everyone knows what Paul Craig wants in every fight that he's in. He wants you in his guard. He needs you in his guard to get his game going, and it's just too predictable at this point in his career. I mean, one win in his last 7 fights, like that has to be one of the worst stats on this whole card in terms of fighters and their records. I don't think Bukauskas is silly enough to try and take down Paul Craig, and he's going to want to keep this fight standing where he's at his best, and he won't let Paul Craig get comfortable with his game and allow him to lay on his back. And even if Bukauskas does find himself in that situation, it's not some surprise submission attack that's coming from Paul Craig. Everyone knows uh now this is basically his whole game. It's a it's not a surprise submission. It's an expected submission attempt, and it's too predictable. And I'm sure Bukauskas knows that for sure. I don't think Paul Craig is going to have an easy time closing the distance enough so that he takes Bukauskas down. And if he does, I don't think it'll be easy to try and hold him down or gain control time on Bukauskas either. I think Bukauskas can easily land a devastating knockout shot, but even if he doesn't need a knockout to win this fight. He can definitely outpoint Paul Craig uh, to a decision, landing the much more convincing shots throughout the fight, stinging him with some punches, managing his distance, won't get hit from Paul Craig's lower tier boxing, and just strike from range. And he has good takedown defense, and it won't be easy to take Bukauskas down if Paul Craig tries to do so. So I think Bukauskas has good enough grappling skills to keep this fight on the feet and completely outstrike Paul Craig in this one. So I'm taking Bukauskas, the fast, fluid striker, solid takedown defense, and he's at his prime right now at 31 years old, fighting a guard-based grappler, Paul Craig, who has one win in his last 7 fights, and he's known to be pretty chinny. So I just think Bukauskas has a clear striking edge, and he's gonna stuff any predictable submissions coming his way. Moving on to our next fight, we got Faris Ziam versus Kaue Fernandes. I gotta start practicing how to pronounce these fighters' names before like starting uh these videos, but I'm taking Faris Ziam to win this fight. You know, it's so funny how Kaue Fernandes was like a 5-1 underdog in his last fight versus Guram. I picked Fernandes to win that fight, but that was just pure domination. Guram, he didn't show anything at all in the UFC to be that big of a favorite. Maybe because he had Chimaev and Topuria in his corner, but from watching tape, Guram had no business being that big of a favorite on a somewhat skilled opponent in Kaue Fernandes. Fernandes, he has 2 wins in the UFC, but nothing impressive, right? Muhammad Yaha and Guram, just not impressive wins, really. He made quick work of Muhammad Yaha and dominated Guram all 3 rounds, which is what he should be doing to those level types of opponents, that low level type of opponents. He uses kicks so well. He's a Muay Thai striker with a very kick heavy approach, and he's definitely not a stranger to grappling, but he can be taken down, which is the only way he has lost in the UFC, being taken down by Mark Diakis. Even though Fernandes landed the more damaging shots, he lost that fight due to the takedowns. Fernandes, he has an aggressive style. He comes forward and tries to finish you. Again, very kick heavy, and it works out for him. He has leg kicks, high kicks, which he's gonna need in this fight because he's fighting Faraz Ziam right now, which is a big challenge. Faraz is well-rounded, just really clean striking, great takedown defense, coming off of a great performance to a great fighter in Mike Davis, where he outstruck him, defended 7 out of 8 takedowns, which really put him on the map. One of the more impressive victories on his resume. His striking, it's really clean, real power in his shots, very fast and accurate, can work really well in the clinch using his knees. This is ultimately going to be a striker versus striker type of fight. And from what I've seen, Faraz Ziam has the more experience, even as the younger fighter. He has the better wins on his record, but that doesn't mean Kaue isn't good. It just means he's still unproven and hasn't fought a fighter with a big enough name to prove himself yet. But I'm still leaning towards Faraz to win. The last time he was in Paris, he had a crazy knockout against Matt Frivola where he kneed him unconscious. And I feel like Faraz rises to the occasion. I trust his cardio. I trust his stamina. And I think he can stay composed against a dangerous striker, find the better shots in this fight and win a decision here. I feel he will be more accurate with his shots. He can defend any takedowns really nicely if he has to. And because Kaue Fernandes is such a kick-heavy fighter, I think Faraz can capitalize on that, and he can find openings by timing those kicks and landing punches when he does throw a kick. And because that's pretty much how Kaue approaches many of his fights. He loves to start out with kicks, and I think Faraz is the type of guy to download that information and start using it against him. And Kaue is aggressive. He likes to come forward so he can potentially run into a shot that lands on the right spot, and he could get sat down from Faraz Ziam in the striking exchanges. They're both really dangerous, though, and this is going to be a fun striking match. But Faraz is more proven, more experienced, and I feel he has a slightly better skill and well-rounded game. Being able to initiate the clinch, land some nice shots in there, and I think his grappling is better too. And on the feet, they're both really skilled, but still, I think Faraz is going to be a bit more accurate in this one, landing the better shots. I think he's going to be more locked in his home crowd in Paris. Plus, he's coming off of a really impressive victory. I just think the clean striking of Ziam and the strong takedown defense is going to help him win. He's a very patient striker, and in Paris, he's going to be very dangerous, being composed, finding the right shots, being accurate against Fernandes, who's going to come forward. He's aggressive. He's very kick heavy, but I think he's going to be too hittable in this one, and he's vulnerable to getting hit in the clinch as well and getting taken down. So I just think Faraz Ziam, he's more accurate and better all well-rounded game. So I'm going Faraz Ziam. Moving on to our next fight, we got Bolaji Oki versus Mason Jones. My pick is going to be Bolaji Oki to win this fight. Bolaji Oki has some of the nicest striking in the game. He's very calm, very composed, he's patient, and when he strikes, it's like a cobra. He's really trying to sting you with his shots, then goes back to having his guard up, being calm, being patient, then strikes you again. He really knows how to find the right shots and come forward, as well as putting pressure on you. Even though he's putting that pressure on you, he's very defensively sound. He comes forward and he finds the right shots, strikes you with the right shots, and he really stings you, and that can be very discomforting. He knows how to break his opponents down. He could be in the he could be undefeated in the UFC if it wasn't for the Chris Duncan fight where he was winning the striking exchanges. Then he's the one who shoots a takedown only to get caught in a guillotine, which wasn't the smartest move, but I think that was a learning experience for him. He goes on to win his next fight against Michael Aswell, a tough opponent who showed resilience, but Oki was able to push the pace and break him down as the fight went on, landing the more output and finding the right shots to the body and some sharp right hands as well throughout that fight. And he's facing Mason Jones, who likes to put pressure on his opponents. He's a decent boxer himself. He mixes in takedowns more than Oki does, I would say. He can also push the pace. He has excellent cardio. I think he's more well-rounded than Oki in terms of mixing in the wrestling, using his jiu-jitsu in his fights. They're both really good at boxing, and I think that's where this fight will take place for the most part on the feet. And if that's the case, I think Bolaji's boxing is just a tad bit sharper. I'm leaning towards Oki because I think his boxing, and I think because of his boxing, I think this fight will take place mostly on the feet. And I think the way he is able to pressure opponents is key here in this matchup. He really likes the opponent. He really likes to make the opponents get uncomfortable the way he strikes. And Jones, he's good. He'll be throwing leg kicks, using his own boxing to compete, but he is more hittable, I would say. And I think he'll be eating some nice shots throughout the fight here. I just think Jones will then want to mix in the wrestling after realizing the striking isn't going his way, and I think Oki knows that. I think he expects to get I think he expects takedowns coming from Mason Jones, and he can adapt to what the fight presents. He can strike him from a distance to defend those takedowns if he has to, and I don't think Mason Jones is easily going to out grapple Oki by any means. This isn't Jeremy Stevens we're talking about. This is Bolaji Oki. He's patient. He's a sniper. He has sharp boxing, and he just has that dangerous pressure, that dangerous boxing pressure. And Jones, he's gonna pressure as well. He's gonna come forward, use his boxing, use his wrestling. But I think he just has weaker defense, and he is hittable as well. When it comes to sharp strikers, so I'm going Oki. I think he's going to be able to land the cleaner shots, be more accurate with his shots, and I think they're going to have more impact than Jones's punches. So I think he's going to be able to adapt to the pace and be able to defend the takedowns as well. So next fight on the card, we're going to break down and discuss Mauricio Ruffy versus Benoit Saint Denis. Benoit Street Dennis. I'm going Mauricio Ruffy to win this fight. I don't think I'm ever going to pick against Mauricio Ruffy unless I have like a solid reason to believe he won't win this fight. He has looked so good in every single one of his fights. Every time he fights, it's like he gets better. I mean, his last performance was absolutely flawless versus Bobby Green, and now he's finally getting a bit more uh tougher competition in this one, a ranked French opponent in France. Now things are heating up. Things are getting interesting. When I saw Rufi's debut in his UFC, I was I saw that he was going to be a rising star. I picked him to win ever since that debut. Uh he's consistent. He wins. He looks like a prime McGregor when he wins. It's exciting. It's gets you riled up, and he's good. I'm not sure what the odds are here. Uh I hope they see him fighting a ranked opponent and he's fighting in enemy territory, so the odds won't be anything too crazy like a minus 500 or anything. But I really don't know what to expect with the odds nowadays. I'm 100% sure he'll be the favorite, and I think he'll at least be a minus 250, minus 300, at least be somewhat in that range for this fight. And I'm not going to pick against him here versus Benoit Street Dennis, who got dominated by Renato Moicano, got destroyed by Dustin Poirier, and lost his debut versus Zaleski dos Santos. Now he has to fight a prime Conor McGregor. Anytime you get an athlete like Rufi, it's just so nice. Like, you already know they're going to dominate their fight. They come out and they're so consistent in doing so. And it's exciting to watch. This matchup, it's going to be interesting though. He'll be fighting someone who's primarily a grappler and will actively try to take him down. And considering how dangerous Rufi is on the feet, I imagine that would be Benoit Saint Denis' main priority in his game plan. But in his stand up, Benoit Saint Denis, he is aggressive. He likes to come forward and attempt to discomfort his opponents. But coming up against someone as skilled as Rufi will be managing distance so well, using his footwork so effectively, and sniping you with the right shots consistently. And each shot he's throwing is fired in an attempt to land cleanly on you. And BSD, he usually sets up his takedowns with his striking. He isn't some Chimaev type of fighter who instantly rushes in for a double leg. He stands with you first, tries to work his way into the takedowns, and those are going to be the most dangerous parts of this fight for BSD. In those moments, standing with Ruffy, trying to find the right shots to set up the takedowns will be exactly when Ruffy's moving around and sniping him from a distance. And I think if Dustin Poirier can survive the first round after BSD took him down, then come back in the second round and knock BSD out like that, I think Ruffy can do the same thing essentially. If Renato can easily take Benoit Saint Denis down and dominate on the ground, I think Ruffy is strong enough to stuff any takedowns coming his way from BSD and keep the fight where he's landing the more devastating shots on the feet. Even if BSD gets him down on the mat, by the time it took BSD to close that distance and get close, he would have ate such hard shots already, closing that distance, that even if Ruffy gets taken down, he would have already landed enough shots, enough damaging shots to win him the round. And that's if Ruffy doesn't knock him out with one of those shots while BSD is trying to close the distance. I just think Ruffy will be able to maintain his striking distance, be dangerous throughout the fight. Ruffy has 100% takedown defense, I believe, so far in the UFC. I think he will need to use some of that takedown defense here. I think he'll be successful in doing so. And we'll find the openings on BSD's chin because we've seen it get cracked before. I think Ruffy, he'll be patient. He'll find the right counter shots to put BSD away. And this will, however, be the best grappler that Ruffy has faced. So, finally fighting a ranked opponent here. So there's questions that need to be answered in terms of how good his takedown defense is. I'm going to assume it's high level, just like his striking is. And, Ruffy's a rising star right now. Elite striking, 100% takedown defense. And his performances recently, they've been looking flawless, especially his last one. BSD is going to come in as an aggressive grappler, but he's hittable. And he's had his chin tested by elite competition. He's gotten his chin cracked by elite competition. So I just think Mauricio Ruffy, he's too sharp. He's gonna be stuck. He's gonna be able to stuff the takedowns. And I think he can find a knockout in this matchup. Moving on to our next fight, we got Nasruddin Imavov versus Caio Borralho, the main event of the evening. I'm going Caio Borralho to win this fight. I'm going Caio. I mean, just looking at their stats, Caio hasn't lost a fight in 10 years on a 15-fight win streak, 7-fight win streak in the UFC. His boxing has looked great. His jiu-jitsu has looked great. He's the leader of the Fighting Nerds, already talking about fighting Chimaev. Confidence booming through the roof right now. Has free spirit tatted on his neck. I'm leaning Caio to win. He seems like he's really in the zone right now. His grappling is elite and his striking is strategic. He uses his jabs and kicks to close the distance before going for takedowns. He's never getting into any brawls where he puts himself in danger. He's patient. He has a high fight IQ. He doesn't rush to get a finish. And in his last fight with Cannonier, he really took his time to break him down. He controlled the distance nicely, invested early with the leg kicks, and in that fight, he got hit in the fourth round with a solid right hand, from Cannonier that cut Caio, but he took it well. He showed durability, he showed the resilience, and stuck to the game plan. Then drops Jared in the fifth round with his own left hand shot. So it was just a overall dominant win. And at the same time, right now, Imavov, he's looking really good too. His nickname, the Sniper, has been suiting him. His last performance versus Israel Adesanya, that was a big deal. That's a huge statement to make in the middleweight division. Even though Izzy's 36 and Imavov is 30, that's still super impressive to pull off a win like that against a legend of the game. And it kind of hurt to see that. When Izzy made his debut, that was around the same time I started getting into MMA. So I watched every fight of his career. So I've always been a big fan of Izzy. And to see him get sat down like that by an actual knockout shot, not a TKO like Alex Pereira, by a clean right hand shot that sat him down, it was sad for sure, but it's still extremely impressive performance by Imavov, which proves he really is a big deal, because no one has ever done that to Izzy. Pereira TKO'd him, Blachowicz out wrestled him, and Strickland outpointed him. and Dricus subbed him. But Imavov friggin' sat him down with a sniper of a right hand. And the thing is, if Imavov were to land that shot, that same shot, right hand, on Caio Borralho, I don't think it'll sit him down like that. Caio, he's built like a tank. He's super durable, only 32 years old. He's in his prime right now. I think Kyle will be more durable in this one, and he'll have the more power in his shots, I believe. And we've seen Imavov have trouble in the UFC before, and that's not something we can say about Kyle. We've seen Imavov lose to Strickland. We've seen him lose his second fight in his UFC career to Phil Haas. These are things Kyle takes into consideration. He'll study these things. And of course, Imavov has grown since those fights, now currently on a 4-fight win streak. But Kyle learns how to break you down. It's like he implements a strategic game plan specifically designed for you in order to take you out. That's just the type of fighter he is. He's so strategic in there. Imavov, he is a big guy though. He's going to have some power in his shots as well. I think he'll be able to land some shots on the feet for sure. I just think Kyle will have more power and impact in his shots, and he'll be able to get into his flow state quicker than Imavov will. I don't know. Like the power, it could be even, but I'm just leaning with Kyle to have more power. And yeah, I do think Kyle will be able to get in his flow state quicker than Imavov. Imavov needs some time to settle in, where Kyle looks locked in as soon as the bell rings. He's immediately starting his game plan to break you down, kicking your legs, putting the pressure on you. I think Imavov is definitely skilled enough to stuff some takedown attempts from Kyle as well. Once Kyle tries, which will then keep the fight on the feet, which can be better for Imavov. But if the fight does hit the ground, I have to favor the wrestling and elite jiu-jitsu of Kyle. And if it doesn't hit the ground, Kyle's striking and durability is more than good enough to strike and stand with Imavov. And ultimately, that means Kyle has more paths to victory in this matchup. And as this fight goes on to the later rounds, I'm favoring Kyle's cardio better than Imavov's cardio. Kyle, he always finishes strong. He took some damage in the fourth round in his last fight with Jared, comes back in the fifth round, and then drops him. And to be fair, Imavov beat Roman Dolidze in a 5-round fight and beat Brendan Allen on a 3-round fight, which is good to see. But again, more paths to victory for Kyle over those 5 rounds. I think Kyle will invest in those leg kicks early, keep a sharp jab in his face. He'll be able to take him down, I think. And I think Imavov needs this fight on the feet, and that's his best path to victory. But I don't think Kyle needs this fight on the ground. It's not like he has fish out of water level of striking. He's durable. He can strike in a very smart way, not get into a brawl, trying to go chin for chin. I think Imavov will be good enough to stuff a lot of takedowns, but I believe in Kyle's chances on the feet as well as his ability to actually get this fight on the ground. So I'm going with the momentum 15 fight streak right now for Kyle. Elite grappling, smart pressure, and he's very durable. Coming up against a dangerous sniper like Imavov, who just knocked out Izzy. But I just don't like the inconsistencies that he's had in his past. I feel Kyle can be taking advantage of that and kind of download information on how to break you down. So ultimately, I just think Kyle, he has more paths to win. I think he has the cardio edge and definitely the grappling edge in this matchup. So I'm going Kyle to win, most likely a decision. And that concludes the picks for this week's UFC fight card. Let me know what you guys thought. Let me know who you're rolling with. Drop your predictions down below. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my picks, or if you thought they were the absolute worst picks ever. I'd love to see what y'all thought. As always, I hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a great day. Love you guys. That's it for me. I'm out. Peace.